life. That's a bacteria. No, it's a wiggly line on a rock. First place, Mars and Earth are a long ways away from each other. As we circle around the sun, the closest they ever get is about 1/2 of an astronomical unit, or about 45 or 50 million miles. That's the closest we get. To put this in an analogy folks can understand, if we shrank Mars and Earth down to and made them into a couple of tomatoes, Earth would be a 4-inch tomato, Mars would be a 2-inch tomato. Mars is half the diameter of the Earth. The closest they get in their orbit is 1/3 of a mile away at that scale. If I told you I want you to shoot that 2-inch tomato so that a piece of it flies off and lands on the 4-inch tomato, 1/3 of a mile away. But you cannot leave a dent in the 2-inch tomato. It's going to be impossible. If something hit Mars hard enough to blast a rock off all the way to Earth, it ought to leave a dent on Mars. A huge dent. It would take an enormous amount of energy to eject a rock into orbit off of Mars. Even though Mars has less gravity and a less escape velocity than Earth, it still has gravity and has an escape velocity. I don't think you can blast a rock off of Mars. But maybe they did. Here are some problems with this, some things people need to understand. Number one, they claim it came from Mars. There is no proof that it did. Number two, they claim it broke off 16 million years ago, drifted around through space, and finally landed on Earth 13,000 years ago. You don't know any of that. That's hocus pocus stuff. For one thing, if this bacteria is on this rock, the explosion and the drifting through space and the re-entry to Earth's atmosphere would totally remelt this rock and destroy any evidence of this bacteria. So what did this bacteria eat for all that time? How did it survive the impact, the vacuum of space, the entry, the freezing for 13,000 years? It's interesting, NASA funded the research on the rock, and at the same time, NASA grant money was stalled in Congress. Congress was deciding, do we really need to spend all these billions of dollars on NASA? Their money was held up. They had to find something. They already had that rock sitting in a closet for 7 years, I believe. They said, let's get out the Mars rock, and let's claim it came from Mars, and that'll get our grant money. And it worked. News media picked it up, spread this all over the news. Oh, they found life on Mars. Congress said, oh, really? Well, they must be finding something important. Let's give them their money. They released the grant money. Then a couple of weeks later, they announced, oh, well, guess what? We discovered it's not really a bacteria. It's a crystal that forms normally. Oops, we made a mistake. But guess what? They kept the grant money and kept on researching. I'm not against NASA. I'm against using federal funding to try to prove evolution. I'm not against going to the moon or going to Mars. I'm not against any of that stuff. But I think that there may be another ulterior motive here. Maybe the purpose of the space program is to prepare the world for Big Brother, for the New World Order. Maybe that's the real purpose. And I think everybody should be fully informed of what's going on with NASA. I doubt there's life on other planets. First place, there's no proof there is. Okay, so if somebody wants to argue there is, they're arguing from the negative, which is a poor position to be in. Secondly, the Bible says Eve is the mother of all living. I have a hard time getting around that verse. I mean, the Bible says she's the mother of all living. So I don't think there's life on any other planets. Next question. What about theistic evolution? Couldn't God use evolution to get us here? Well, there are all kinds of people who claim to be theistic evolutionists. Okay? We have an entire debate for 5 hours with me against Hugh Ross, and he would not call himself a theistic evolutionist. He says, I do not believe in evolution, but he does believe an awful lot of things like the evolutionists believe, like the earth is billions of years old, and God needed billions of years to get it just right for us to live here. So, the theistic evolutionist, I think, is trying to ride 2 horses at the same time. And they're going in opposite directions, like Don Boy says. His book that we sell is hilarious. I like Don Boy's and his attitude. He just blasts them, you know. He's really a character. So I would say no, theistic evolution is not possible. First of all, what kind of God would need to use evolution? Can't he make it right first time? Well, what do you mean by God? People say, I believe God used evolution. Well, then you got a different God than I do. It's not the clear teaching of the Bible, and I think it would be a retarded God that had to do that, to use evolution to get us here. A Nobel Prize winner, Jacques Monod, in biology, he commented on theistic evolution. He said, natural selection is the blindest, most cruel way of evolving new species. and more complex and refined organisms. The struggle for life and elimination of the weakest is a horrible process against which our whole modern ethics revolts. An ideal society is a non-selective society, one where the weak is protected, which is exactly the reverse of the so-called natural law. I am surprised that a Christian would defend the idea that this is the process which God more or less set up in order to have evolution. I agree, Jacques. God would not use that process. The God of the Bible did not use evolution to get us here. God did it right in 6 days, just like the Bible says. One fellow from Northwestern University wrote, "Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not the Protestant God of waste not, want not. He is also not a loving God who cares about his productions. He is not even the awful God portrayed in the book of Job. The God of Galapagos is careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray." Well, I agree with that one too. So those who try to mix evolution with Christianity or mix evolution with God have a different God. Okay? The Bible says, through faith we understand that God framed the worlds. God created it. He did it right in 6 days. Exodus 20 tells us he did it all in 6 days, and he rested the seventh day. And the Bible says his works were finished from the foundation of the world, and he rested on the seventh day. It is not at all using any evolution. In Genesis 2, it says God ended his work on the seventh day, and he rested from all his work which he had made. Romans 5 tells us man brought death into the world. Adam brought death into this world. No, God did not use any evolution to get us here. God made us in his image. So, points to consider about this. Number one, depends what you mean by God, if you think God used evolution. It's certainly not the clear teaching of the Bible, and it's a retarded God that can't make it right first time. My Bible says God's work is perfect. He does it right the first time. And it's not the character of God to use misfits and suffering and death. Charles Darwin said in his book, "Thus from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object we're capable of conceiving, the production of higher animals, directly follows." See, Darwin had a different God. He thought he had to use suffering and death and misfits. That's not correct. Fifthly, theistic evolution nullifies the need for the death of Christ. Why did Christ die on the cross? If death was already here in the world before Adam came, then why did Christ die on the cross? Sixthly,